We believe that there is the mystery of the hardening in part of Israel, but it's for our sake. But there's also the blindness of the church for Israel and a veil over the nations with regard to Israel. The new covenant was made with the house of Israel and the house of Judah. When Jesus lifted the cup, he says, this blood, this is my blood, this wine, this cup, my blood poured out for you, my Jewish friends. Later, the new covenant was opened for us Gentiles to come in. If you want to know where and when, read Acts 10 with Cornelius, the man from Italy. When Peter came and preached the gospel to them, these Gentiles, suddenly the Holy Spirit was poured out on all of them. So there you have the start of the church from the Gentile world, you might say. But all the promises that God gave to the church will be as much fulfilled as he will fulfill all the covenants he made with Israel. But unfortunately, there is a blindness over the church with regard to Israel. Yes, there's blindness in Israel as well. When Paul speaks in Romans 9 till 11 about Israel, he says, there is a hardening in part of Israel. Yes, some Jews see who Jesus is. They can get the revelation apparently, but 99% does not. Yes, they are not without God, but they have a blind spot for who Jesus is. But Paul explains that's because of us Gentiles, in order to bring us into that new covenant relationship. He said to his own firstborn son, to Israel, now you will not be without me. Jews are not without God, but they have a blind spot for who Jesus is. Only some of them get a revelation, because first God is gathering a people for his name from the Gentile world. But one day he will come back and give the revelation about Jesus to Israel as well. So there is the mystery of the hardening in part of Israel, but it's for our sake. But there's also the blindness of the church for Israel. It's because of that theological concept where the church says God is finished with the Jews. We, the church, are the new Israel. We, the new chosen people. And of course, we as a church are a chosen people for his name from the Gentile world. But we never, ever replaced Israel. If you say such a thing, you make God into a liar, who said, I have everlasting covenants. I promised. I swore a solemn oath when I made these covenants. And you say, no, he halfway changed his mind. If that would be possible, you cannot trust God. He can say one day this and another day some. You cannot trust him anymore. No, the covenants with Israel are solid. They are there forever, covered by an oath of God. But the promises to the church are there as well. We will, when one day the kingdom from Jerusalem, the kingdom of peace, the fulfillment of the covenant that he made with Israel, that from Jerusalem peace would flow into the world, and the church will have its role to play as well. It's beautifully formulated in the final book of the Bible. That's the book of Revelation, where God reveals the glory of Jesus Christ. And to the church, Jesus, the risen Lord, says in Revelation 2, to the church in Thyatira, verse 26, Jesus says, to him or her who overcomes and does my will to the end, I will give authority over the nations. When he comes as the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, the Messiah of Israel, he will rule all over the world. Then the Torah will go out from Jerusalem as a guiding light for all the nations. But he says, I will not just rule over the world all by myself. Who overcomes, I will give authority over the nations. And then a quotation from Psalm 2. He will rule them, these nations, with an iron scepter. He will dash them to pieces like pottery. If need be, he will rule with power, not free advice. And we, the church, will rule with him. Just as I have received authority from my Father. So the authority of my Father I will share with you, my church. So the promises he gave to the church are rock steadfast and steady as well. But there's also not just a blindness in the church for Israel, there's also a veil over the nations with regard to Israel. When you look at all these anti-Israel resolutions in the United Nations, then you see that there is no understanding whatsoever about the special position that Israel has. But one day that will change as well. One day Israel will get the revelation about Jesus. One day the church will understand what Israel is all about and share in the kingdom together with the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords and with Israel over the nations of the world. And the nations, the veil that is covering them will be taken away as well. Where and when and by whom? By Jesus. When he comes to Jerusalem. The prophet Isaiah says in Isaiah 27, he will deliver Israel, and on that mountain he will take away the veil that covers the nations. So that's wonderful that in Jerusalem the blindness that the nations have for Israel will also be taken away, so that Israel, the church, and the nations will be fully aware of the glory of God and of his righteous rule all over the world.